Why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval castle. The popular imagination often conjures up romanticized images of medieval castles, towering stone fortresses, valiant knights, grand banquets, and noble lords and ladies adorned in flowing silks. These are the vignettes painted by Hollywood and historical novels, offering a sanitized, often heroic vision of a bygone era. Yet peel back the layers of romanticism, strip away the cinematic gloss, and the unvarnished reality of medieval castle life emerges as a stark, brutal, and profoundly uncomfortable existence. For anyone accustomed to the most basic conveniences of the 21st century, running water, electricity, climate control, sanitation, medical care, and privacy, a single day within those formidable stone walls would not merely be an inconvenience, it would be a jarring, potentially sickening, and deeply distressing ordeal that would likely send you fleeing for the relative comforts of a modern sidewalk, let alone a home. You wouldn't last a day. Your first sensory assault upon entering a medieval castle wouldn't be the imposing architecture, but the overwhelming assault of smells. Forget fresh air. The very air you breathe would be a pungent, layered tapestry of odors that would turn a modern stomach. There would be the ever-present stench of human and animal waste. Latrines, or garderobes, were often little more than stone chutes built into the castle walls, emptying directly into the moat or a cesspit below. The prevailing winds would carry these effluvia back into the castle, particularly in the lower levels or near the latrine towers. Add to this the pervasive aroma of unwashed bodies, both human and animal, as personal hygiene was rudimentary at best. Stables, often within or directly adjacent to the castle walls, contributed their own powerful bouquet of horse manure and straw. The lingering scent of burning wood and charcoal from countless hearths, cooking fires, and forges would hang heavy in the air, mixing with the smells of stale food, fermenting ale, and various industrial processes like leatherworking or tallow rendering. Your nose, accustomed to deodorizers, regular sanitation, and fresh ventilation, would be in a perpetual state of shock, likely triggering nausea within hours. Beyond the olfactory, the physical environment itself would be a relentless torment. Castles were built for defense, not for comfort. Their massive stone walls, while excellent at repelling invaders, were equally efficient at radiating cold. Even on a balmy summer day, the interior of a castle would retain a damp, pervasive chill, a constant clammy presence that seeped into your bones. In winter, it would become a true icebox. Imagine waking up to frost clinging to the inside of your chamber walls, your breath pluming in the frigid air. Fireplaces, though often enormous, were remarkably inefficient at heating large stone rooms, and much of the heat, along with vast amounts of smoke, would escape through narrow openings or cling to the ceilings. Windows, frequently unglazed and covered only by wooden shutters or oiled parchment, offered little barrier against biting winds, rain, or snow. Drafts would be a perpetual companion, snaking through every crack and crevice, making it impossible to escape the cold. You'd be perpetually shivering, your muscles tensed against the chill, your skin raw from the dry, smoky air. Food and drink would present a dual challenge: monotony and risk. Your diet would be a stark departure from the varied, readily available fare of today. For most castle inhabitants, meals revolved around staples like coarse bread, often made from various grains and sometimes gritty from millstones, thick pottage, a gruel-like stew of vegetables, pulses, and perhaps a small amount of meat if you were lucky. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare and certainly not available year-round, leading to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Meat, a luxury for most, would likely be cured or salted. Without refrigeration, food preservation was rudimentary. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying. This meant a distinct lack of fresh ingredients and a constant risk of spoilage. You'd be perpetually wary of your next meal, knowing that food poisoning was a common and often fatal ailment in an era devoid of modern antibiotics. As for drink, potable water was a constant gamble. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste. To avoid illness, ale, cider, or weak wine were the preferred beverages, as the brewing process involving boiling helped to kill pathogens. Yet, even these could be of poor quality, and their constant consumption would lead to a dull, almost perpetual state of mild inebriation for many, along with the risks of impurities. The most intimate and pervasive discomfort would stem from the lack of personal hygiene and the omnipresence of parasites. Daily hot showers are a modern marvel. In a medieval castle, bathing was a rare, arduous affair, involving hauling large quantities of water, heating it, and typically sharing large, often quickly dirtied wooden tubs. Most people simply didn't wash frequently, leading to pervasive body odor. Hair washing was equally infrequent, creating ideal breeding grounds for head lice. Regardless of your social standing, you would be sharing your personal space, and indeed your very body, with an unwelcome array of companions: fleas, lice, and bedbugs. These tiny creatures thrived in the straw mattresses, rough woolen clothing, and the general lack of sanitation. Imagine trying to sleep through a night of constant itching, the prickle of tiny legs crawling across your skin, the sting of their bites. This wasn't just an annoyance. These parasites were vectors for debilitating diseases that could swiftly kill. Your skin would perpetually feel greasy, your hair matted, and your body would be a canvas of itchy welts. Finally, the social and psychological landscape would be utterly alien and draining. Privacy, as a concept, barely existed. Even the lord and lady of the castle would have personal attendants sleeping on pallets in their bedchambers, ready to serve at a moment's notice. For everyone else, communal sleeping in the great hall or cramped barracks was the norm. Every aspect of your life, from eating to sleeping to bodily functions, would be under observation or in close proximity to others. Your days would be governed by a rigid, inescapable hierarchy and relentless duties. Whether you were a noble, a knight, a servant, or a peasant, life revolved around duty, survival, and endless labor. There was little leisure time, as we understand it, and intellectual stimulation was minimal for most. Beyond the physical discomforts, the constant underlying threat of violence, disease, famine, or sudden death would induce a pervasive state of anxiety. Justice was swift and often brutal, and medical care was primitive to non-existent. You would be a stranger in a world utterly unconcerned with your comfort or individual rights, driven by necessity and harsh realities. In summary, a medieval castle would be a sensory overload of unpleasantness, a physical challenge to endure its cold and damp, a culinary minefield, and a psychological test against total lack of privacy and constant threat. Your 21st century body and mind, accustomed to warmth, cleanliness, safety, and personal autonomy, would recoil. You wouldn't last a day. You'd be a shivering, itching, nauseated, and utterly bewildered wreck by the time the castle's creaking portcullis rose for dawn.
Boring history for sleep. Why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval castle, and more. The grueling daily chores of a castle servant. If the lord and lady of a medieval castle might have experienced a semblance of comfort, albeit still far removed from modern standards, the vast majority of a castle's inhabitants, the numerous servants, lived a life defined by relentless, backbreaking, and often thankless labor. Forget the romanticized image of cheerful, aproned maids or jovial, loyal butlers. The reality of a medieval castle servant's daily existence was a grueling regimen of dawn to dusk toil, dictated by the unforgiving rhythms of the sun, the seasons, and the insatiable demands of their feudal masters. A single day in their shoes would quickly expose the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of their lives. Your day as a castle servant would begin long before dawn, roused by the first faint light or the insistent clang of a bell. There was no gentle alarm clock, no leisurely breakfast. Your sleep would have been on a lumpy straw pallet, likely shared with several others in a cramped, cold, and drafty communal sleeping area, perhaps the Great Hall, a rudimentary barracks, or a small, unheated antechamber. Your first task would not be to attend to your own comfort, but to the needs of the castle. One of the most fundamental and physically demanding chores was hauling water. Castles, for all their defensive might, rarely had sophisticated plumbing beyond simple drainage. Water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and bathing, which was rare, had to be manually transported from the castle well, a nearby stream, or a cistern. Imagine carrying heavy wooden buckets, often weighing many pounds when full, up and down steep, uneven stone staircases, across muddy courtyards, and through dimly lit passages multiple times a day. This was a constant, repetitive task, regardless of weather or personal fatigue. In winter, wells might freeze, or paths become treacherous with ice, adding further peril to an already arduous chore. The sheer physical strain on your back, shoulders, and arms would be immense, a chronic ache that never fully dissipated. Equally relentless was the tending of fires. In a cold, damp stone castle, warmth was a constant battle, and fire was the primary weapon. This meant an endless supply of firewood and charcoal needed to be chopped, hauled, and meticulously maintained in dozens of hearths, from the great hall and kitchen to the lord's private chambers and the guard rooms. You would be responsible for lighting these fires in the morning, keeping them stoked throughout the day, and carefully banking them at night to preserve embers for the next day. This wasn't just physical labor, it involved the constant presence of smoke, ash, and the inherent danger of working with open flames in a structure built largely of flammable wood and straw within its stone shell. Your lungs would ache from the smoke, your clothing would be perpetually stained with soot, and the threat of burns would always loom. Cleaning in a medieval castle was a futile, never-ending battle against pervasive dirt, dust, and grime. There was no vacuum cleaner, no disinfectant spray, and certainly no concept of sterility. Floors, whether stone, wood, or packed earth, were swept with crude brooms, but the dust generated by daily life, the tracking in of mud, the shedding of straw from mattresses, and the constant presence of animals, dogs, cats, and even livestock wandering through outer courtyards meant that true cleanliness was impossible. Imagine scrubbing pots and pans in cold, often greasy water without soap as we know it, or trying to wipe down tables that quickly accumulated a film of soot and food residue. Latrine areas, despite being cleaned regularly, a truly unenviable task, would still reek and harbor filth. The servants responsible for managing waste would have faced the most stomach-churning tasks, dealing directly with human and animal excrement, a job that often led to illness. Beyond these core duties, a servant's day was filled with a multitude of specific tasks depending on their role. Kitchen staff, scullions, turnspits, and laundresses faced immense heat, smoke, and noise. They processed raw ingredients, turned spits over open fires for hours on end, washed endless amounts of dishes in cold water, and scrubbed surfaces, all while dealing with the constant threat of burns, cuts, and the pervasive smell of cooking, and often spoiling, food. Chamberlains and personal attendants to the nobility had to manage wardrobes, which involved beating out dust and vermin from clothes, not washing, assist with dressing, run errands, and attend to every whim of their masters, often working long, unbroken hours with little rest. Their duties might include emptying chamber pots, a grim reality of even noble life. Stable hands dealt directly with horses, mucking out stalls, feeding, grooming, and preparing them for rides or battle. This was a messy, physically demanding, and often dangerous job given the temperament of some animals. Brewers and bakers labored in hot, often claustrophobic conditions, managing fermenting vats and enormous ovens, ensuring a constant supply of ale, cider, and bread for the entire castle population. Laundry servants faced the grueling task of hand-washing heavy woolens and linens in cold water, often by a river or stream, then laying them out to dry, a process that could take days depending on the weather. This was physically taxing and often involved caustic lye solutions. Meals for servants were simple, often eaten quickly and standing, a brief respite before returning to duty. There was no concept of a work-life balance. Your life was your work, subservient to the castle and its inhabitants. Even your few hours of sleep could be interrupted by calls for assistance, a night alarm, or the needs of your master. There were no weekends, no holidays in the modern sense, only the relentless cycle of daily chores. And moreover, the life of a servant was defined by lack of autonomy and social vulnerability. You were at the mercy of your employers. Disobedience or inefficiency could lead to harsh punishment, reduced rations, or even dismissal, which for many meant starvation or becoming a beggar. There was little opportunity for advancement or education. Your identity was intrinsically tied to your role, and your labor was a perpetual sacrifice to the upkeep and defense of the castle and the lifestyle of its elite. In essence, a medieval castle servant's day was a relentless marathon of physical exertion, unhygienic conditions, monotonous tasks, and constant subjugation. The sheer unending nature of the work, coupled with the primitive living conditions and the ever-present threat of illness or punishment, would quickly break anyone accustomed to the relative ease and freedom of modern life. You would not last a day. You would collapse from exhaustion, hunger, and sheer disbelief at the ceaseless, thankless grind.
What it was really like to sleep in a medieval castle. Forget the plush mattresses, climate-controlled rooms, and private sanctuaries of modern bedrooms. The reality of a night's sleep in a medieval castle was a far cry from restful. It was a constant battle against biting cold, persistent damp, unyielding surfaces, and the relentless company of unseen, unwelcome inhabitants. To truly understand, one must discard every contemporary notion of comfort and embrace a sensory experience dominated by discomfort, itch, and the pervasive chill of ancient stone. Your journey into medieval slumber would begin not with slipping under a soft duvet, but with confronting the overwhelming cold and pervasive drafts. Castles, magnificent as they were built for defense, not insulation. Their colossal stone walls, while excellent at repelling invaders, were equally efficient at radiating the chill of the outside world directly into every chamber. Even on a summer's day, a castle's interior retained a cool, damp quality, like a perpetual cellar. In winter, it transformed into an icebox. Imagine a bedroom where your breath plumed visibly in the air, and frost might cling to the inside of the unplastered stone walls. Windows where they existed were often unglazed openings covered only by wooden shutters or perhaps a thin sheet of oiled parchment or stretched animal bladder, offering minimal barrier to the biting wind. Every crack in the masonry, every ill-fitting door served as a conduit for relentless drafts that snaked across the floor and up through whatever meager coverings you possessed. For the lord and lady, a grand four-poster bed with heavy velvet or wool curtains offered a crucial, albeit primitive, defense. Drawing these thick drapes created a small, slightly warmer microclimate within, a desperate attempt to trap body heat against the vast, frigid expanse of the room. Without such a luxury, the common castle inhabitant, a guard, a servant, a foot soldier, slept exposed to the full brunt of the cold, their nights punctuated by shivers and the constant desire for more warmth. The beds themselves were a testament to practicality and necessity over any concept of luxury. For the vast majority, a bed was often little more than a straw mattress or a pallet laid directly on the hard stone or packed earth floor. These mattresses were rudimentary sacks, typically made of coarse linen or canvas, stuffed with dried straw or rushes, or sometimes even leaves. While cheap and readily available, they offered scant cushioning.
Picture the constant rustling and crunching with every toss and turn, the brittle stalks poking through the fabric, creating an uneven, lumpy, and unyielding surface that quickly molded to uncomfortable hollows. Over time, the straw would compact, decompose, and become a haven for vermin and dampness. Such a bed provided no ergonomic support. Waking with aching backs, stiff necks, and numb limbs was a daily reality. Even for the castle's nobility, true comfort was a relative term. Their mattresses might be stuffed with feathers or down, providing a softer experience. These would often rest on a wooden frame strung with ropes or leather straps, which acted as a rudimentary spring system. The familiar phrase, "sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite," directly references these ropes, which needed to be tightened regularly to prevent the mattress from sagging excessively. Despite the feather stuffing, these beds lacked the contouring support and plushness of modern mattresses, meaning even the Lord could wake with aches. Perhaps the most universally shared nocturnal torment was the incessant companionship of parasites. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were not an occasional nuisance, they were a constant, unavoidable fact of medieval life. They thrived in the close quarters, the general lack of personal hygiene, and the very structure of the bedding itself. Straw mattresses were ideal breeding grounds. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep only to be roused by the distinct prickle and itch of tiny creatures crawling across your skin, their bites leaving angry raised welts that demanded to be scratched. The constant irritation would make deep, uninterrupted sleep a rare and cherished luxury. It wasn't just discomfort. These parasites were active vectors for debilitating and often fatal diseases, contributing significantly to the rampant illnesses that plagued medieval populations. While some efforts were made to deter them, such as placing aromatic herbs like lavender, sweet woodruff, or pennyroyal within bedding, their effectiveness was limited against the sheer scale of the infestations. Changing and airing out straw mattresses was a chore, but truly eradicating an infestation required a level of cleanliness and pest control unknown to the age. Privacy was a luxury almost entirely absent in a medieval castle. Even the lord and lady would typically have personal attendants, such as pages or squires, sleeping on simple pallets on the floor of their bedchamber, ready to assist at any moment. For everyone else, communal sleeping was the absolute norm. Soldiers might share crowded barracks. Servants would bed down in the great hall or a shared antechamber, often a dozen or more individuals, side by side. Imagine the cacophony: snoring, coughing, restless turning, whispered conversations, and the various sounds of bodily functions in a world without dedicated, private facilities. This lack of personal space meant constant sensory input from your fellow sleepers, making deep restorative sleep even harder to achieve. Beyond the immediate bed and its inhabitants, the pervasive smells of the castle would follow you to your sleep. Even with a drawn bed curtain, the air quality would be poor. The lingering odors of the day's cooking, the distinct smell of unwashed bodies, the pervasive stench from the garderobes, and the ever-present smoke from the hearths would combine into a heavy, unmoving atmosphere. Fires, while providing some warmth, also filled the rooms with soot and particulate matter, irritating eyes and lungs, and often leading to coughing fits. There was no concept of ventilation beyond opening a window, which would only exacerbate the cold and drafts. Finally, the very unpredictability and insecurity of medieval life would plague your slumber. There was no guarantee of safety. The castle, for all its strength, was a fortress in a dangerous world. The distant sounds of a barking dog, the shuffling footsteps of a patrolling guard, the creaking of timbers in the night, or a sudden alarm bell could instantly jolt you from any fleeting peace. The constant threat of attack, fire, or the rapid spread of illness meant that true, deep relaxation, free from worry, would be an exceptional luxury. Your sleep would be shallow, punctuated by disturbances, and rarely truly restorative. In essence, sleeping in a medieval castle was not a retreat into comfort, but an endurance test. The unrelenting cold, the unyielding surfaces, the biting parasites, the lack of privacy, and the array of unpleasant smells would make every night a struggle.
For anyone accustomed to the warmth, cleanliness, and security of a modern bedroom, a single night in a medieval castle would be an utterly miserable, unforgettable ordeal, rendering you exhausted and broken by the first faint light of dawn.
The medieval castle latrine, a smelly truth. Among the many uncomfortable realities of medieval castle life, few concepts are as starkly different from our modern existence as sanitation, or more accurately, the severe lack thereof. At the heart of this discomfort, both physical and olfactory, lay the castle latrine. Far from the clean, porcelain conveniences of today, the medieval toilet was a crude, often malodorous, and fundamentally unhygienic necessity that played a significant role in the daily struggles and health challenges of castle inhabitants. Understanding the medieval latrine is to truly grasp one of the most pervasive, invisible hardships of living within those grand stone walls. The most common form of a medieval castle toilet was the garderobe, sometimes spelled garderobe or gardrobe. The name itself offers a peculiar insight, deriving from French words meaning to guard the robes. This suggests that a secondary, perhaps even primary function, was to act as a rudimentary closet where the ammonia fumes from the human waste below were thought to repel fleas and other vermin from clothing hung there. This dual purpose immediately hints at the medieval mind's practical, if unappetizing, approach to waste management. Architecturally, a garderobe was a simple affair, a small, often unlit or dimly lit chamber built into the thickness of a castle wall. Inside, a stone bench with a keyhole-shaped opening was the seat. Below this opening, a vertical shaft or chute descended through the wall, designed to carry human waste away. Where did it go? The most common destinations were directly into the moat surrounding the castle, into a specially dug cesspit at the base of the wall, or, less commonly, directly onto the steep slope of the castle mound, allowing it to eventually wash away or accumulate. The immediate, inescapable problem with this design was smell. Gravity might pull the waste down, but it couldn't contain the accompanying effluvia. The chutes often acted like chimneys in reverse, drawing foul odors from the accumulating waste below directly up into the garderobe chamber and, crucially, into any adjacent living quarters. On warm days, the stench would be overwhelming. Imagine a perpetual, inescapable miasma of raw sewage hanging in the air, particularly near the latrine towers or in the lower parts of the castle. This was not a fleeting odor. It was a constant, pervasive presence that medieval inhabitants simply had to endure, often masking it with strong perfumes, herbs, or by simply becoming desensitized to it. Beyond the smell, garderobes were a breeding ground for filth and disease. Despite the vertical chute, waste often splattered, clung to the stone walls of the shaft, and built up in the receiving cesspit or moat. There was no flushing mechanism beyond perhaps an occasional bucket of water poured down, a rare and laborious act. This created a perpetually damp, warm, and nutrient-rich environment, ideal for bacteria, fungi, and critically, vermin. Flies, drawn to the waste, would swarm, carrying pathogens from the cesspit directly into the castle's kitchens and living areas. Rats, attracted to the refuse, would infest the lower parts of the castle, acting as vectors for diseases like the bubonic plague. The very act of using a garderobe thus carried a significant risk of exposure to pathogens that could cause dysentery, typhus, and a host of other debilitating and often fatal illnesses. Cleaning a garderobe was an unenviable task, often falling to the lowest-ranking servants. It involved periodically emptying the cesspits, a truly disgusting and dangerous job. Imagine descending into a dark, reeking pit, shovel in hand, to remove years of accumulated human waste. This night soil might then be used as fertilizer, adding another layer to the medieval world's recycling of human waste, but also contributing to the spread of disease through agricultural products. The stone chutes themselves were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned or disinfected, remaining perpetually coated in a layer of grime and bacteria. The lack of privacy associated with garderobes also contrasts sharply with modern expectations. While a garderobe offered more privacy than simply relieving oneself outside, it was often a communal experience in a broader sense. In larger castles, multiple garderobes might be located close together along a wall, or a single garderobe might serve many people, leading to queuing. There was no concept of individual sealed-off bathroom stalls. Furthermore, the small enclosed nature of the chamber, combined with the draftiness from the open chute, made them unpleasant in cold weather and potentially alarming in the dark. For those of even lower status, or in smaller, less grand fortifications, even a garderobe might be a luxury. Soldiers might use large communal pits in the outer bailey, or simply relieve themselves wherever convenient, contributing to the general unsanitary conditions of the castle grounds. This casual disposal of waste meant that pathways, courtyards, and even parade grounds could be contaminated, especially after rain, when waste might wash into areas where people lived and worked. In summary, the medieval castle latrine, the garderobe, was a crude and malodorous necessity. It represented a constant source of discomfort, a breeding ground for disease, and a stark reminder of the fundamental differences in sanitation practices between then and now. The pervasive stench, the risk of illness, the constant presence of vermin, and the sheer unpleasantness of the act itself would be an immediate and overwhelming assault on anyone accustomed to the clean, private, and hygienic facilities of modern life. It's a smelly truth that underscores just how challenging even the most basic human functions were within the stone walls of a medieval castle.
How the castle kitchen worked, or didn't. Step into the medieval castle kitchen and any romantic notions of quaint, bustling efficiency quickly dissipate into a haze of smoke, heat, and cacophony. Far from the pristine, meticulously organized culinary spaces of today, the castle kitchen was a chaotic, often dangerous, and perpetually grimy hub that operated on brute force, limited technology, and an unyielding demand for food for hundreds of mouths. It was a place of ceaseless labor, immense pressure, and a sensory overload that would shock anyone accustomed to modern culinary conveniences. The very architecture of the medieval kitchen often set the stage for its challenges. Unlike modern kitchens, it was frequently a standalone building, or a wing slightly separate from the main living quarters. This was a deliberate design choice, necessitated by the constant threat of fire. Despite the stone construction of castles, the presence of roaring, open flames, stored firewood, and greasy, flammable cooking byproducts made fire a terrifying and ever-present danger. Even with this separation, the kitchen was still very much at the heart of the castle's daily rhythm, a hub of activity from dawn until late into the night. At the core of the medieval kitchen were its enormous open hearths and fire pits. There were no gas stoves or electric ovens. All cooking, from roasting to boiling to baking and smoking, relied on carefully managed wood fires. Imagine an enormous fireplace, often big enough for a person to stand inside, where massive logs constantly burned. Above these fires, spits laden with entire animals, oxen, pigs, deer, would be turned manually for hours, a grueling task often assigned to younger servants, or turnspits. Kettles, often gargantuan, would hang directly over the flames, bubbling with stews, pottages, or water for scalding. The heat emanating from these fires, especially in summer, would be suffocating, turning the kitchen into a sweltering inferno. Smoke was an inescapable reality. While some kitchens had rudimentary chimneys, they were often inefficient. The air would be perpetually thick with the acrid smell and visual haze of wood smoke, stinging the eyes, coating the lungs, and blackening every surface. Cookware, walls, and even the cooks themselves would be perpetually coated in soot and grease. Ventilation was poor. Opening doors or shutters might provide some relief, but would also introduce cold drafts in winter or flies in summer. The preparation of food was an incredibly labor-intensive process, demanding a large, specialized staff.
There were no prepackaged ingredients, no blenders, no food processors. Each and every item had to be processed from its raw form. Butchers would hack apart fresh carcasses, often hanging directly in the kitchen or an adjacent larder, creating a bloody, visceral scene. Pluckers would tirelessly defeather fowl. Scullions would spend hours scrubbing pots and pans, often using sand or ash as abrasives in cold, greasy water, without the benefit of soap. The sheer volume of dishes, especially after a feast, would be staggering. Chopping and grinding were endless tasks. Vegetables, herbs, and spices had to be hand-chopped, pounded in mortars, or ground with quernstones. Bakers needed enormous quantities of dough by hand, stoking massive ovens, often separate from the main hearth, to bake bread for the entire castle. Sauce makers and pastry cooks worked with a precision that belied the chaos, often relying on medieval cookbooks that contained few measurements, instead relying on experience and intuition. The logistics of ingredients added another layer of complexity. Food was sourced locally and seasonally. Supplies varied wildly based on harvest, hunting success, and trade. Large quantities of perishable goods had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, often right within or near the kitchen area. This meant constant activity with fresh deliveries of live animals, sacks of grain, and baskets of produce, all requiring immediate processing or storage. The larder, a cool, dark room, would be filled with barrels of salted meat, dried fish, cheese, and hanging cured hams, creating its own distinct set of smells. Hygiene, by modern standards, was practically non-existent. While medieval cooks likely kept their personal areas as clean as possible given the constraints, the kitchen itself was a battleground against contamination. Flies swarmed, attracted to food scraps and animal byproducts. Rats and mice were an ever-present menace, drawn by the abundance of food, and would constantly scurry through storage areas. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products spoiled quickly, and distinguishing between fresh and slightly off food was a matter of skill and necessity, but certainly not foolproof. The very act of preparing food in an environment exposed to dust, smoke, and vermin meant a constant, unavoidable risk of foodborne illness, which, given the primitive medical care, was often fatal. The pressure on the kitchen staff was immense. Feeding hundreds of people, from the high-status lord and his family to the lowliest servant and soldier, 3 times a day, every day, required meticulous planning and relentless effort. Special occasions like feasts or the arrival of important guests would multiply the workload exponentially, demanding exotic ingredients, complex dishes, and round-the-clock preparation. Errors were not merely inconvenient, they could be costly, lead to hunger, or even incur the wrath of the lord. In essence, the medieval castle kitchen was a raw, visceral, and demanding environment. It was hot, smoky, noisy, and perpetually on the edge of chaos. The sheer physical labor, the constant presence of fire and sharp implements, the unyielding demand for food, and the battle against spoilage and filth would make it an utterly overwhelming experience for anyone accustomed to the sterile, convenient, and controlled environments of modern kitchens. You wouldn't last a day. The heat, the smoke, the relentless work, and the pervasive grime would quickly drive you out.
Medieval castle defenses, more than just walls and moats. When one pictures a medieval castle, the mind immediately conjures images of towering stone walls, formidable battlements, and perhaps a deep, dark moat. These iconic features were indeed the bedrock of a castle's defense, visual declarations of impenetrable strength. However, the true efficacy of a medieval castle's defensive system extended far beyond these static architectural elements. It was a complex, multi-layered strategy involving ingenious design, constant vigilance, psychological warfare, and a deep understanding of both siegecraft and the human element. To truly appreciate a castle's defensive prowess is to understand that its strength lay not just in its stone, but in its holistic and often brutal integration of physical barriers, active measures, and the preparedness of its inhabitants. The physical architecture was, of course, paramount. Walls, or curtain walls. These were not just single barriers, but often comprised multiple layers. The outer curtain wall, frequently punctuated by towers, would be the first line of defense. Its sheer height and thickness, often 10 to 20 feet thick at the base, made it incredibly difficult to breach with early siege engines. The battlements, or crenellations, provided cover for defenders, allowing them to fire arrows or drop projectiles on attackers while remaining relatively protected. Towers, strategically placed at corners and along the curtain walls, provided flanking fire, meaning defenders could shoot arrows at attackers assaulting the wall from multiple angles, preventing them from finding safe spots. Larger gatehouse towers were often the most heavily fortified points. Moats. A wet moat filled with water served multiple purposes. It made it difficult for attackers to bring siege towers or battering rams close to the walls, forcing them to build causeways under fire. It also acted as a psychological barrier and helped to prevent tunneling or sapping beneath the walls. Dry moats, or ditches, were equally effective at creating an obstacle, often studded with sharpened stakes. Gatehouses. These were complex defensive nightmares for an attacker. They weren't just simple doorways, but often multi-story fortresses in themselves, incorporating a series of deadly features. Portcullises. Heavy, iron-shod wooden grills that could be rapidly dropped to block an entrance. There were often two or more in succession. Murder holes, or meurtières. Openings in the ceiling above the entrance passage through which defenders could drop stones, boiling water, hot sand, or quicklime onto attackers trapped below. Arrow slits, or loopholes, designed to allow archers to fire outwards while offering minimal target to attackers. Barbicans, outermost defensive works, often freestanding towers or walls designed to control the approach to the main gate, forcing attackers into a vulnerable path. Beyond these static defenses, active defensive measures were crucial. Projectiles. Archers and crossbowmen were positioned on battlements and in towers, raining down arrows and bolts. Trebuchets, or ballistas, large crossbows within the castle, could hurl heavy stones at enemy siege engines or formations. Boiling liquids or hot sand, while boiling oil is largely a myth, too precious to waste. Hot water, quicklime, or even just heavy stones dropped from battlements or murder holes were devastatingly effective. Hot sand poured down on attackers could scald and blind them through gaps in their armor. Counter-sapping? Defenders were acutely aware of the threat of tunneling. Listeners would be stationed in underground passages or tunnels to detect enemy sappers, and countermines would be dug to intercept and collapse enemy tunnels. Manning the walls. A castle's defense was only as good as its garrison. Knights, men-at-arms, and even trained commoners would be constantly drilled in defensive tactics, their positions assigned and their readiness maintained. Psychological warfare also played a significant, if less tangible, role. The sheer size and impenetrability of a castle could demoralize an attacking army before the first arrow was fired. The sight of a well-manned wall, with banners flying and a disciplined garrison, often led to sieges being abandoned or negotiated. Conversely, the defenders themselves needed strong morale, fueled by faith, loyalty, and the grim determination to protect their home and their lord. Mocking or taunting the enemy from the walls was a common tactic. Internal politics and preparedness were as vital as stone and steel. A strong, united leadership within the castle was paramount. The lord, or his appointed castellane, had to ensure adequate supplies. A castle under siege needed immense stores of food, water, and fuel for the garrison and inhabitants, sometimes for months or even a year. Without these, even the strongest walls were useless against starvation. A well-trained garrison? Soldiers needed constant training in archery, melee combat, and the specific defensive procedures of the castle. Loyalty. A castle could be betrayed from within. Internal divisions, disgruntled servants, or disloyal knights could open gates or reveal weaknesses, making loyalty a critical, though often fragile, defensive asset. Intelligence. Knowing the enemy's strength, plans and movements was crucial for preparing an effective defense or launching a successful sally, a sudden attack from the castle. Finally, the castle's defenses were a testament to endurance and attrition. Sieges were long, brutal affairs. The goal of the attacking force was often not to breach the walls directly, but to starve out the defenders, break their morale, or force a surrender. A castle's defensive system was designed to buy time, to make the cost of attack prohibitively high, and to wear down the enemy until they gave up. Every design choice, from the thickness of a wall to the location of a well, contributed to this ultimate goal of outlasting the besieger. In essence, a medieval castle was a multifaceted defensive machine, a symbiotic blend of passive architectural might and active human vigilance. Its defenses were an intricate dance between overwhelming physical barriers, ingenious traps, and the sheer will and training of its inhabitants. It was a testament to survival in a brutal world where every stone, every archer, and every prepared meal contributed to its ability to stand a formidable guardian against the relentless tides of conflict.
The chilling reality of castle dungeons. The word dungeon instantly conjures images of dark, damp, and cold subterranean cells, a place of despair and torment. For once, the popular imagination is not far off. Medieval castle dungeons were not merely holding cells, they were instruments of control, fear, and often slow, agonizing punishment. Life within their stone embrace was a chilling testament to the era's brutality, designed to break the spirit as much as the body. To spend even a short time in such a place would be to confront a level of sensory deprivation, physical discomfort, and psychological terror that is almost unimaginable to the modern mind. The architecture of a castle dungeon, often referred to as an oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, was grimly functional. These were typically small, windowless chambers located deep within the castle's foundations, often beneath the keep, gatehouse, or even the main hall. Access was usually through a murder hole or a narrow opening in the ceiling, through which prisoners were lowered, or less commonly, through a heavy, bolted door. Once inside, escape was virtually impossible. The walls were thick, unyielding stone, perpetually cold and often seeping with moisture, leading to a pervasive, bone-chilling dampness that gnawed at the joints and seeped into clothing. Light was a luxury denied. Most dungeons were pitch black, relying only on a sliver of light from the access hole when opened, or perhaps a flickering, smoky torch held by a guard. This profound darkness contributed significantly to the psychological torment, disorienting prisoners and stripping them of any sense of time. The lack of natural light made it impossible to distinguish day from night, blurring the boundaries of reality and plunging the captive into a world of endless, oppressive gloom. The only sounds might be the drip of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, or the distant echoes of life above, serving only to highlight the prisoner's isolation. The air quality in a medieval dungeon would be suffocating. With no ventilation other than the access point, the air would be stagnant, heavy with the smell of mold, stale food, and most potently, human waste. Sanitation, already rudimentary in the rest of the castle, was non-existent in the dungeon. Prisoners were left to relieve themselves in the corner of their cell or into a crude bucket that was rarely emptied. This created a putrid, sickening atmosphere, attracting swarms of flies and making every breath a noxious experience. The combination of dampness and poor ventilation also made the dungeon a fertile breeding ground for mildew and disease, ensuring that sickness was a constant companion to the captive. Physical conditions within the dungeon were designed for maximum discomfort and degradation. Beds were non-existent. Prisoners slept directly on the cold, hard stone floor, often without even straw for bedding, or perhaps a meager, lice-infested handful. The constant dampness would quickly lead to chills, rheumatism, and a pervasive ache in the bones. Space was often minimal, forcing prisoners to remain hunched or cramped,
further contributing to physical pain and atrophy. Restraints, such as chains, manacles, or leg irons, were common, limiting movement and adding to the agony. These restraints could be fixed to the wall or floor, forcing the prisoner to an awkward, painful position for extended periods. The diet of a dungeon prisoner was meager and designed for bare subsistence, not sustenance. Often it would consist of stale bread and tainted water, delivered infrequently and without ceremony. This deliberate deprivation of proper nourishment led to rapid weight loss, weakness, and vulnerability to disease. The combination of malnutrition, poor hygiene, and constant dampness would quickly lead to scurvy, dysentery, fevers, and various skin afflictions. Medical attention, if any, was rudimentary and rare, often reserved only for prisoners of high ransom value. For the common captive, illness in the dungeon was a slow death sentence. Beyond the physical torment, the psychological impact of dungeon life was perhaps the most chilling. The isolation was profound. Stripped of human contact, light, and any sense of time, a prisoner's sanity would slowly erode. The constant darkness fostered hallucinations and paranoia. The sheer boredom and monotony could drive a person mad. The knowledge of their complete powerlessness, entirely at the mercy of their captors, would be a crushing burden. For prisoners awaiting trial or execution, this psychological torment would be compounded by the crushing weight of their uncertain fate. Whispers of other prisoners, or the distant sounds of torture, if the castle had a dedicated torture chamber, would only add to the terror. Dungeons were not just for criminals. They also housed political prisoners, rivals, or those awaiting ransom. The treatment could vary, with high-status prisoners sometimes receiving slightly better provisions if they were deemed valuable. However, the core elements of discomfort, darkness, and isolation remained. The chilling reality was that for many, the dungeon was a place where they were literally forgotten, left to waste away until death claimed them. To endure a day, let alone weeks, months, or years in a medieval castle dungeon would be an unimaginable ordeal. The cold, the stench, the darkness, the isolation, the hunger, and the constant battle against illness and despair would strip away every vestige of a person's physical and mental well-being. It was a place designed not just to hold, but to punish, degrade, and ultimately to consume those unlucky enough to be cast into its depths.
Medieval castle medicine, pain, herbs, and superstition. Imagine a world where a broken bone could mean lifelong disability. A simple cut could fester into a fatal infection, and the most common remedies involved herbs, incantations, and bloodletting. This was the chilling reality of medieval castle medicine. Far from the sterile, science-driven practices of today, healthcare within the castle walls was a rudimentary, often painful, and profoundly uncertain endeavor. A blend of limited practical knowledge, inherited folk wisdom, and deep-seated superstition. To fall ill or suffer an injury in a medieval castle was to enter a terrifying lottery, where survival often depended more on luck and resilience than on the efficacy of available treatments. The castle's primary healthcare provider was typically the lady of the castle herself, or one of her trusted female attendants. These women, particularly those of noble birth, were often educated in the practical application of herbal remedies. Knowledge of herbs and their supposed medicinal properties was passed down through generations, often recorded in household books. They would collect, dry, and prepare various plants to concoct poultices for wounds, infusions for fevers, or purgatives for digestive issues. While some herbs did possess genuine medicinal qualities, e.g. willow bark for pain relief, a precursor to aspirin, the dosage was imprecise, and their effectiveness varied wildly. This was a form of pragmatic care, rooted in empirical observation, but lacking any understanding of germ theory or accurate diagnosis. Beyond the lady's herbal cabinet, the castle might occasionally host a barber surgeon. This individual, as their name suggests, performed a dual role. Barbers, skilled with sharp implements, were the closest thing to a surgeon available. Their tools were basic: razors, knives, saws, and cauterizing irons. They performed procedures that ranged from tooth extractions and setting simple fractures to amputations and bloodletting. Bloodletting, the practice of drawing blood from a patient, was perhaps the most ubiquitous and enduring medical practice, believed to rebalance the body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Leeches were also used for this purpose. While occasionally helpful for specific conditions, it was often debilitating and could even hasten a patient's demise by weakening an already sick individual. Wound care was brutally primitive. Without antiseptics, any open wound was an invitation to fatal infection. Wounds would be cleaned, often with wine or vinegar, which did have some antiseptic properties, poultices of herbs applied, and then bandaged with linen strips. However, the instruments used were rarely sterilized, and the understanding of how infections spread was non-existent. A deep cut, a compound fracture from a fall, or a battle wound was a leading cause of death, often from gangrene or sepsis. Minor injuries that we treat with a Band-Aid today could become life-threatening. Pain management was crude. Beyond willow bark or perhaps some rudimentary opiates, like opium poppy if available, severe pain was simply endured. Surgical procedures, such as setting a broken limb or amputating a gangrenous one, were performed without anesthetic, save perhaps a strong drink. The screams of the patient would echo through the castle, a terrifying testament to the agony endured. The medieval understanding of the human body and disease was governed by the theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors within the body. Treatments such as bloodletting, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, and dietary restrictions were designed to restore this balance. While providing a theoretical framework, it often led to ineffective or even harmful treatments. Superstition and religious belief were inextricably linked to medieval medicine. When earthly remedies failed, or for illnesses that baffled understanding, people turned to divine intervention. Prayers, pilgrimages, the veneration of saints' relics, and exorcisms were common responses to sickness, reflecting the deep faith and fear of the unknown that permeated medieval life. Illness was often seen as divine punishment for sin, or the work of demonic forces, further complicating rational treatment. Common ailments in a castle were numerous and often endemic. Gastrointestinal illnesses, dysentery, typhoid, and other forms of food poisoning were rampant due to poor sanitation, contaminated water, and spoiled food. Respiratory infections, the cold, damp, smoky air led to widespread colds, coughs, and pneumonia. Skin conditions, flea and lice infestations caused constant itching, open sores, and secondary infections. Injuries, falls, cuts from tools, and battle wounds were frequent occurrences. Childbirth was a terrifyingly dangerous event for both mother and child, with high mortality rates. The plague, when outbreaks of the Black Death occurred, medieval medicine was utterly powerless, leading to catastrophic death tolls. In essence, medieval castle medicine was a desperate struggle against omnipresent illness and injury, conducted with limited knowledge, rudimentary tools, and a heavy reliance on tradition and faith. It offered little in the way of comfort, and often involved painful, ineffective procedures. To face sickness or severe injury in such an environment would be a terrifying ordeal, underscoring just how precarious life was and how profoundly different the medieval experience of health and healing was from our own.
The role of animals in castle life. Beyond the human inhabitants, medieval castles teemed with an astonishing array of animals, each playing a critical, often unrecognized role in the daily functioning, survival, and even the very atmosphere of the fortress. From noble steeds to working dogs, from essential livestock to omnipresent pests, animals were not merely companions. They were integral to defense, sustenance, labor, and status, deeply interwoven into the fabric of castle life in ways that would be utterly alien to a modern urban dweller.
To spend a day in a medieval castle would be to constantly encounter, smell, and interact with a bustling, often messy animal kingdom. Foremost among the castle's animal population were the horses. These magnificent creatures were indispensable for warfare, transport, and hunting, defining the very essence of knighthood and chivalry. War horses, or destriers, massive, powerful, and highly trained horses, were a knight's most valuable asset, capable of carrying a heavily armored man into battle. They were incredibly expensive to acquire and maintain, requiring dedicated stable hands, specific feed, and constant care. Their stables, often within the castle walls, would be a bustling, noisy, and pungent place filled with the scent of hay, manure, and horse sweat. Palfreys were lighter, faster horses used for everyday riding, travel, and hunting. Pack horses and draft horses were essential for hauling supplies, construction materials, and performing agricultural labor on the castle's lands. The constant presence of horses meant meticulous stable management, including mucking out stalls, a relentless and smelly chore, grooming, feeding, and shoeing by the castle blacksmith or farrier. Dogs were equally ubiquitous and performed a variety of crucial functions. Hunting hounds, large, powerful dogs like greyhounds, wolfhounds, and mastiffs, were vital for hunting deer, boar, and other game, providing essential meat for the castle's table. They were trained, valued companions for the nobility. Guard dogs, fierce, protective breeds, were used to guard the castle perimeter, alerting the garrison to intruders. Their barking would be a constant background noise, especially at night. Rats and vermin control. Smaller, agile terriers were kept to hunt rats and mice, an indispensable service in a place constantly battling vermin infestations that threatened food stores and spread disease. Companions. Even beyond their utility, dogs offered companionship, particularly to the lord and lady, and their presence softened the harshness of castle life for some. Livestock formed the backbone of the castle's sustenance, often housed in the outer bailey or immediately adjacent to the castle walls. Cattle provided beef, milk, hides for leather, and horns for various implements. Dairy cows would be milked daily, with the milk processed into butter or cheese. Pigs were a highly efficient source of meat, thriving on scraps and easily fattened. Their meat was often salted and cured for winter. Sheep provided mutton from meat and, more critically, wool for textiles. Fowl, chickens, geese, ducks, and pigeons, kept in a dovecote, provided eggs and meat. Chickens would often wander freely in the bailey, pecking for scraps. The sounds of these animals, the lowing of cattle, the squealing of pigs, the clucking of chickens, would be a constant auditory backdrop to castle life, mixing with the smells of their enclosures. Beyond these working and food animals, the castle was also home to a less welcome yet omnipresent animal kingdom: pests. Rats and mice, attracted by food stores and waste, these rodents were a relentless plague, gnawing through provisions, contaminating food, and acting as vectors for diseases like the plague. Despite efforts to control them with cats and terriers, they were an undeniable part of castle life. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs. As discussed previously, these parasites were ubiquitous, thriving on humans and animals alike in the unhygienic conditions, causing constant itching and spreading disease. Flies. Swarming around animal waste, kitchen scraps, and latrines, flies were a persistent nuisance, buzzing, landing on food, and contributing to the spread of illness. Hunting birds, particularly falcons and hawks, were highly prized and maintained by the nobility. Falconry was a popular pastime and a source of food, requiring specialized care and training for the birds, often housed in mews within the castle. Even cats played a vital, if often understated, role. While some were kept as companions, their primary function was rodent control, silently patrolling the larders and halls, keeping the rat and mouse population in check. The sheer volume of animals within and around the castle meant a constant cycle of feeding, watering, mucking out, and managing their health. This was arduous, messy labor. The waste produced by so many animals contributed significantly to the castle's pervasive odors and unsanitary conditions.
Diseases could spread rapidly among the animal population, threatening the castle's food supply and potentially jumping to humans. In essence, animals were not merely present in a medieval castle, they were woven into its very fabric. Their sights, sounds, and smells were a constant, defining feature of daily life. From the thundering hooves of war horses to the scuttling of rats in the walls, the animal kingdom underscored the raw, visceral, and pragmatic reality of medieval existence, where every creature served a purpose in the grand, challenging endeavor of simply surviving. For anyone accustomed to the relatively animal-free environments of modern homes and cities, the medieval castle's bustling animal population would be an immediate and overwhelming sensory experience.
How the castle kitchen served feasts and wasted food. The medieval castle kitchen operated on two vastly different modes: the grinding, monotonous daily grind of feeding hundreds of people with basic fare, and the explosive, often wasteful grandeur of the feast. While everyday meals were a matter of survival, feasts were theatrical displays of wealth, power, and hospitality, pushing the chaotic kitchen to its absolute limits. Understanding this dichotomy, particularly the scale of a banquet and the inevitable waste it generated, reveals another fascinating yet often disturbing aspect of medieval castle life that would shock a modern sensibility. For the vast majority of castle inhabitants, daily meals were a matter of sustenance. As explored in previous segments, they consisted primarily of pottage, coarse bread, and perhaps some salted meat or cheese. These meals were eaten quickly, often communally, and without much ceremony. The kitchen's daily rhythm was one of efficiency dictated by necessity, ensuring everyone received enough calories to perform their duties. However, the feast was an entirely different beast. A feast was not just a meal, it was a carefully choreographed, multi-sensory spectacle, a critical social and political event designed to impress guests, solidify alliances, celebrate victories, or mark significant religious holidays. These occasions would push the castle kitchen, and indeed the entire household, into a frenzy of activity. The sheer scale of preparation for a feast was immense. Days, even weeks beforehand, the kitchen staff would be consumed by specialized tasks. Procurement. Exotic ingredients, rarely seen on a daily basis, would be ordered or sourced. This could include rare spices imported from the East, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, nutmeg, fine wines from distant vineyards, and specialized foodstuffs like particular fish or game birds. Live animals, sometimes including entire oxen or boars, would be brought into the castle for slaughter and preparation. Mass production. While daily meals were large, a feast demanded exponentially more. Every available cook, scullion, turnspit, and baker would work almost non-stop. Roasting spits would be constantly turning over massive fires, bubbling cauldrons would never cease, and ovens would be continuously stoked for baking fine breads and elaborate pies. Culinary artistry. Feasts were an opportunity for the castle's master cook to showcase their skill. Dishes weren't just prepared, they were often transformed. Whole roasted swans or peacocks might be refeathered and presented as if alive. Pigs or boars could be roasted whole and served upright. Elaborate subtleties, or intricate sugar sculptures, marzipan creations, or even savory pastries depicting mythological scenes or coats of arms would adorn the table, serving as edible art. These required immense skill and time, often by specialist confectioners. Presentation. Food was served in multiple courses, often brought out with ceremony and fanfare. Platters would be laden high, designed to impress with their abundance and visual appeal. When the feast commenced in the great hall, it was a dizzying array of sounds, sights, and, inevitably, smells. The hall would be filled with the chatter of dozens, if not hundreds, of guests, the music of minstrels, and the overwhelming aroma of roasted meats,
rich spices and copious amounts of ale and wine. Servants would constantly bustle, carrying heavy platters and refilling goblets. Diners would eat with their hands, using knives, often their own, to cut meat, and often sharing trenchers or stale bread used as plates with their neighbors. However, beneath this veneer of grandeur lay a significant and often shocking reality: massive food waste. While modern society rightly decries food waste, in a medieval context, it was often a deliberate, if unspoken, byproduct of display. Overproduction as a status symbol. The sheer quantity of food prepared for a feast was often far more than could possibly be consumed. This was intentional. An overflowing table with untouched dishes visually proclaimed the Lord's immense wealth and generosity. It was a tangible demonstration that he had so much he could afford to let some go uneaten. Spoilage during the feast. With no refrigeration, dishes, especially those with sauces or delicate ingredients, would begin to spoil even during the multi-hour duration of a feast, particularly in warm weather. Dishes presented early might become unappetizing by the time later courses were served. Leftovers for lower ranks, sometimes. While some of the broken meats, leftovers from the high table, might be distributed to lower-ranking servants, soldiers, or even the poor waiting outside the castle gates, this was not always guaranteed or systematic. Often, a considerable amount of perfectly edible food would simply be discarded, thrown to dogs, or even into the moat. The sheer scale of preparation meant that not every scrap could be efficiently repurposed. The trenchers. The bread trenchers used as plates would soak up juices and fats. These were typically not eaten by the nobility, but either given to the poor or tossed to the dogs, contributing to visible waste. The feast, therefore, was a double-edged sword. For the privileged few, it was a sensory indulgence and a display of social power. For the kitchen staff, it was a period of intense, back-breaking labor. And for the castle as a whole, it was a moment where the stark contrast between scarcity and deliberate overabundance was starkly evident. The occasional excess of a feast provided a fleeting break from the everyday drudgery and dietary monotony, but the underlying harshness of castle life, including its challenges with food preservation and the grim reality of waste, was never far from the surface. A modern person witnessing such a feast would be simultaneously awed by the spectacle and appalled by the lack of hygiene and the sheer prolificacy of food in a world where many still starved.
The political intrigue within castle walls. Beyond the cold stone, the ceaseless duties, and the constant threat of external enemies, a medieval castle was also a crucible of human ambition, fear, and desire. Within its seemingly impenetrable walls, hidden from public view, a constant, simmering undercurrent of political intrigue ran through the veins of the castle community. This was a world where loyalty was currency, whispers could be more dangerous than swords, and alliances shifted like the wind. For anyone accustomed to transparent governance and democratic processes, the clandestine power struggles, subtle betrayals, and desperate machinations playing out daily would be a bewildering and perilous landscape. At the apex of this intricate web stood the lord of the castle and his immediate family. Their power was absolute within their domain, but it was rarely unchallenged. The lord had to constantly balance the demands of his overlord, the king or a more powerful duke, the needs of his vassals and tenants, the ambitions of his own family members, and the loyalty of his household staff. Every decision, from a marriage alliance to a military campaign, had political repercussions. The stakes were incredibly high: land, titles, wealth, and even life itself. The castle was a miniature court, and every inhabitant, from the highest-ranking knight to the most trusted servant, played a role in the political game, wittingly or unwittingly. Vassals and knights. While bound by oaths of fealty, knights and other vassals often harbored their own ambitions. They might seek to increase their landholdings, gain more influence with the lord, or even subtly undermine a rival. Factionalism was common, with different knights aligning themselves based on family ties, shared interests, or personal grievances. Whispers in the great hall, subtle shifts in seating arrangements at a feast, or the formation of hunting parties could all signal the ebb and flow of power and favor. A knight's loyalty, while sworn, could be a fragile thing, susceptible to promises of greater reward or threats from external powers. Family members. The lord's own family could be a hotbed of intrigue. Younger brothers might resent their elder siblings' inheritance. Sisters might be pawns in marriage alliances, and uncles or cousins might harbor designs on the lordship itself, especially if the lord was weak or had no clear heir. The lady of the castle, despite her domestic duties, often played a crucial role in political maneuvering, advising her husband, forming alliances with other noble women, and protecting her children's interests. Dynastic struggles, sometimes escalating into outright civil war, often had their origins in these castle walls. Trusted officials and servants. Even seemingly humble positions held potential for influence. The steward, who managed the castle's finances and household, could wield immense power through control of resources. The chaplain, as a spiritual advisor, could influence the lord's conscience or spread rumors. Personal attendants, privy to the lord's private thoughts and actions, could be conduits for information, whether intentionally or not. These individuals, if ambitious, could manipulate situations, spread rumors, or act as spies for external factions, all while maintaining an outward facade of unwavering loyalty. Communication and information control were vital tools of intrigue. In an age before mass media, the flow of news and gossip was meticulously controlled. Letters, often carried by trusted messengers, were the primary means of communication with the outside world, and their contents were often encoded or cryptic. Within the castle, rumors spread like wildfire, often deliberately planted to discredit rivals or gauge reactions. Courtiers and servants would constantly be observing, listening, and interpreting gestures, words, and behaviors to discern shifts in favor or impending changes. The ability to gather, control, and disseminate information was a powerful weapon. Favors and patronage were the bloodline of advancement. Gaining the lord's ear, receiving a gift, or being granted a specific duty could elevate one's status and influence. Conversely, falling out of favor could lead to social ostracization, diminished power, or even imprisonment or banishment. Nobles and ambitious servants alike would constantly jockey for position, engaging in flattery, gift-giving, and backstabbing to gain an advantage. Betrayal and espionage were ever-present dangers. A disgruntled guard could open a gate, a bribed servant could poison a meal, or a seemingly loyal vassal could switch allegiances to a besieging enemy. Castles, for all their strength, were vulnerable from within. Spies might infiltrate the household, gathering intelligence on defenses, troop strength, or the lord's weaknesses. The constant paranoia this fostered meant that trust was a rare commodity, and suspicion was a necessary survival instinct. Even everyday events could be imbued with political significance. A hunting party could be a secret meeting, a feast a chance to display power or assess rivals, and a public argument a deliberate challenge to authority. Beneath the veneer of formal ceremony and daily routine, the castle was a constant arena of strategic maneuvering, where alliances were forged and broken, careers were made and shattered, and fortunes were won and lost, all determined by the subtle currents of power. In essence, the medieval castle, while a bulwark against external threats, was simultaneously a hotbed of internal political intrigue. Its inhabitants, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, were entangled in a complex web of ambition, loyalty, and survival,
where whispers could carry the weight of a death sentence, and every gesture could be laden with hidden meaning. For a modern individual, accustomed to transparent structures and personal freedoms, this world of constant suspicion, subtle power plays, and life or death consequences for political missteps would be utterly overwhelming, a constant source of anxiety and peril. You wouldn't last a day without inadvertently stepping on a political landmine.
How medieval castles dealt with fire hazards. In a medieval castle, built primarily of stone, but filled with highly flammable materials, fire was not just a risk, it was a terrifying, omnipresent threat, second only to direct assault or pervasive disease. There were no modern fire codes, no smoke detectors, no readily available water hoses or fire extinguishers. When fire broke out, especially in the dead of night, it could spread with terrifying speed and devastating consequences, transforming a seemingly impregnable fortress into a death trap. Understanding how castles attempted to mitigate this constant peril, and the horrifying reality when their efforts failed, reveals another layer of hardship that would utterly unnerve a modern sensibility. The castle's construction itself offered some inherent, though often insufficient, fire resistance. Stone walls and towers were, by their nature, non-combustible. However, this stone shell contained a vast amount of highly flammable materials. Timber, roofs, floors, staircases, internal partitions, furniture, doors, and even defensive hoardings, wooden galleries built on the outside of walls during a siege, were constructed from wood. Once ignited, these acted as fuel. Thatch and straw, roofs on outbuildings, bedding, straw mattresses, and animal fodder in stables were all extremely combustible. Fabrics, tapestries, curtains, and clothing, typically made of wool or linen, could catch fire easily. Fuel, large quantities of firewood and charcoal were stored within the castle, often near hearths or kitchens. Grease and oil, kitchens, with their open fires and accumulation of cooking grease, were particularly high-risk areas. Lamps and torches, often fueled by animal fat or oil, were ubiquitous for lighting. Given these pervasive hazards, fire prevention was rudimentary but constant. Open hearth management. Fires in hearths and braziers were carefully watched. At night they would be banked, covered with ash to preserve embers but reduce flames, or extinguished entirely where possible. Kitchen design. As discussed, kitchens were often housed in separate buildings or wings, or at least constructed with thick stone walls and few wooden elements to contain any potential blaze. They often had very large open chimneys to draw smoke away, but this also meant a constant draft that could feed flames. Torch and candle placement. While essential for light, torches and candles were fire risks. They would be carried carefully, often in sconces, and extinguished when leaving a room. Servants might be tasked solely with ensuring fires were properly managed and lights extinguished. Water buckets. Buckets of water, though limited in supply, might be kept near strategic areas like kitchens or large halls, ready for immediate use. However, these were woefully inadequate for a substantial blaze. Accessing higher floors or the roof with water was nearly impossible. Smoke inhalation. The thick, acrid smoke from burning wood, thatch, and fabrics would quickly fill the castle, making breathing impossible and disorienting inhabitants trying to escape. Smoke inhalation would be a major cause of casualties. Structural collapse. As wooden supports burned, floors and roofs would collapse, trapping people and creating even more fuel for the fire. The intense heat could also cause stone to crack and shatter, leading to localized collapses. Panic and chaos. A major fire in the confined, maze-like spaces of a castle would inevitably lead to widespread panic. Narrow staircases and passages would become choke points, hindering escape. The noise of crackling flames, collapsing timbers, and terrified screams would add to the horror.
loss of supplies. Beyond immediate danger to life, a fire could destroy vital food stores, weapons, and other irreplaceable supplies, leaving the castle vulnerable to famine or attack. The aftermath of a major castle fire could be as devastating as a siege. Vast sections of the castle could be rendered uninhabitable, requiring years of rebuilding. Lives would be lost and valuable resources destroyed. The event would leave a lasting scar on the castle and its community. In essence, living in a medieval castle meant coexisting with a constant, inherent fire risk. Despite rudimentary precautions, the sheer abundance of flammable materials, the reliance on open flames for heat and light, and the complete lack of modern firefighting technology meant that fire was a pervasive, deadly threat. To experience a castle fire would be to face an uncontrollable inferno, a terrifying and chaotic race against time, underscoring how fragile existence was even within the strongest of fortresses. You wouldn't last a day. The sheer terror and chaos of such an event would be profoundly overwhelming.